Our next speaker is Noah Falstein. He's the founder of the Institute. He has been a professional game developer since 1980, and he was among the first 10 employees at LucasArts, the studio company and DreamWorks Interactive. He has served as the first elected chair of the HBA, and he was chief game designer at Google, working on their Tango AR and glittering the RTX. Currently, Falstein focuses primarily on game developments, but Pixar AR books, and he has been consulting and advising companies from startup to large thing and trade acquisition, depression, program, Leopard, and more. Let's welcome Noah, and I'm set of the sharing.
There were actually, well, that's the way it's doing that all. Well, add to the end of that last thing. I was actually, hoping that Rashid would mention Pearl because I got to experience that actually showed it to me on Google. And I just want to say what's really interesting, in fact, the answer to that question is that I saw it in VR, and like others before me, it brought tears to my eyes. It was actually really emotionally involving. But I watched YouTube later again to see it, and I was surprised at it. What a really good story. And then I've got a new VR headset. I thought, oh, well, we try Pearl again. And suddenly I was hard there. Working with healthcare and neuroscientists, I think, why is this triggering in ER and not working? So one of the unique things about Pearl is that it's essentially shot from the point of view of the passenger seat of the front seat of the car, and much of the action is happening in the car with you. And I'm convinced a big part of why it was so impactful wasn't just that it was in VR, but that the characters thought that they were literally within arm's reach of you. So we all like that and think. Now, if you think those of you in this group right now, you're much more aware of somebody sitting right next to you. If they feel that they are looking threatening in any way to hurt somebody across the room, it's a big part of our brains that is wired to pay close attention to people who are really close to us that way. Both in a positive and empathic way in terms of fear, fight, and so anyway. I think there's some interesting possibilities there in knowledge in this. And I'll also say it's somebody who us and owns a lot. It's very intimidating knowing that this AR is actually capturing everything I'm saying here. If that talks to me, all right, so let's see. I'm going to do where watch this demo in that whole. It's good. Very cool. So, Nathalie, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate being here. It's a great introduction. I won't go into my 45 years of work in the games industry in detail, except to say, just on the overview, I have started this everyday engineering since primarily game programmers. But I've worked mostly in the design and production field since then, and on the creative side. And after working for a bunch of big companies, early in my career, I went on as a freelancer, and except for the 4 years on Google, I've been a freelance game designer and got to work on hundreds of different games over that time. Gradually over time, more and more games in the games and health field that started popping up, action series things, start with. Then it's called Bigs for Health. I found it really interesting. Got to work with folks in Helios. Earlier sheepers did it. I actually worked on prototypes in Helios almost 15 years ago now. And that is still the only game that has been clear to some of my documents. But there are quite a few other treatments that have in the works for that, or have agile treatments that have devices as well as some data that holds communicating. And I'll talk a little bit about monuments as well. But the first big encounter I had was this idea of games for health. I don't really like the term gamification. There was some one very eloquent, Ian Gogos and very eloquent article for the Atlantic called Data Patient is bullcrap. And if you're curious, I would look up that article to see why it's not the best term we use. Jesse Schell's company, Shell Games, uses the term transformational games. I really like that. It's really about transforming people in one way and another. And the first experience I had with that was a company called Oakland, started by Emma Leo, the likes of the man started with eBay, ran a huge personal fortune. She wanted to put her chunk of it into developing healthcare for young people using games. And Remission, I worked on it starting in 2001, so it's 25 years ago. And that was released as a game to help teenagers with who had leukemia, but they had some radiation treatment that they were put on to chemotherapy. And the teenagers, a certain percentage of them said, you know what, I feel fine. This still makes me feel nauseous. I'll just say I'm taking the pill and not take it. Even though their parents and doctors are telling them they wish they, the lies in this. In the game, like inside the body, you're seeing the strain in the middle there. It's pretty low res. She's early 2000s. But it showed them what happens if you don't have the chemo in your bloodstream and how the cancer comes back. And that alone, they then did a big randomized controlled trial across millions of dollars over 300 patients, and showed that it actually had an effect with those parents and doctors that help them and kids to help them be adherents to their medicine. The real eye opener for me that games are not only good for you, and this was an era when we were being told, oh yeah, games are turning kids into killers and violence and all the stuff that's been thoroughly debunked since then. It showed that it wasn't, actually training people to kill people, but it's actually saving lives. It's very kind of. But I also worked on a bunch of other games, Hunger and Planet. I'm sure nobody here has heard of it. It's on a nutrition game. And it was meant to teach young people about good nutrition. And we also did try to see if it worked. And it did. It really taught them a lot about, apple is much healthier for you than a piece of pizza. But then informally, we started saying, so if I were to offer you a snack right now, they said, well, yeah, apple would be happier, but I'd rather have a piece of pizza. And I realized that knowledge alone isn't going to do it. It's really want to transform these people's behavior and make it more than things. So why are games effective? What do we do with them? Well, games are really helpful for new technologies in a lot of different ways that got missed up there because it really made the CD-ROM player commercially possible. And with games early on, we're adding sound and graphics and video exists. And I hear they've done fairly well, actually, with the time work that they were, but it was all based on the games industry and entertainment being able to make some of these things happen. And part of that is because if you are doing a business application or a health application, things got to work exactly right and not risk people's lives. You're making a game and it's not, crashes every once in a while, but you're having fun. That's good enough. There's a lot of room for experimentation in games. It's one of the things that's really worked. The other piece that we have, and a lot of my work now is bringing this to healthcare and training in a lot of different ways, is what my old boss at LucasArts called funactivity. This idea that games are fun and they can sort of measure the level of engagement. Games like Tetris and Civilization, and I two of the most constantly referred to games in terms of game addiction and things that people just couldn't put down. And it's really nice to be able to harness that ability, which can be deleterious if you're, waking up, if you're still awake at 6 in the morning when the sun's coming up and you realize it was just one more friend of civilization. And one, because of the game, and I don't watch out for that. But if you can turn that into actually helping with healthcare, as a lot of people have, then it becomes a force for good. In my days, one of the things that we were doing, it's making games for helping people with strokes recover. You really need to get to them within the first 36 hours or so after the stroke to be able to start purging the brain plasticity to take over and restore their brain function. And in a lot of cases, of course, they're in the hospital for those 36 or 48 hours, and they can't real exposure to the kind of things that help them get better and maybe even centrally deprived, maybe sitting in a hospital. So mind-based, as you see in the picture on the left there, it brings the gameplay to people and lets them take it home with that. And one of the fun things that I like about how games are effective there in this one coming here is that you're going to give these repetitive exercises to get better with the strokes. It can be really frustrating, painful. When you're actually, instead of just saying, go to raise your arm and lower it, you're now saying, all right, can you slow this airplane and fly through the troops and having you that actually happening? The problem became not motivating people to do it, but shutting them off after a period of time because they were straining their muscles, either needing so much and they just didn't want to stop. And they didn't realize this. It's happened to me many times that they were actually doing something that's hurting them because they were so-called pain that was shutting off all of their pain statements. Level X is a really interesting company formed by also a former LucasArts person that teaches professionals a whole bunch of techniques. This particular one was somebody is, I think, a construction person who put nails in their mouth while they were using that video to nail something to hold it along there and actually nail it, inhale the nail and the set to be removed from their windpipe. This is the simulation running on an iPhone. You can actually get continuing medical education credits for using their simulations, keeping you up to date on this. And of course, if you have the choice of playing a game that not only is fun, but it measures your ability by how well you play the game versus going to a classroom, hearing somebody lecture and then having to do some kind of test at the end. It was just no context to what the doctors were. Helping dermatologists, all sorts of different specialists now. So we want to talk about AI and XR. They both come into this in many different ways. The person in the center of the screen there is Demis Hassabis, who recently won a Nobel Prize and was known for founding DeepMind, that's part of Google. Or you see on the left there, AlphaGo was Go playing the version of their AI that beat the world champion Go finally, and now it's being used.
Shut up on YouTube.
Very good. Now being used for finding new types of proteins and coming up with new types of medical treatments. Another great example of how starting with games where, if you're not playing the best Go move, too bad you haven't won, as opposed to actually making a medication that they actually not be effective or dangerous. And Demis, by the way, was working at Lionhead alongside Peter Oliver on games before he got into the AI for the purposes that it's now. A couple of my current clients, Starling AI and Thrive now, they're both using AI. In fact, I've got half a dozen clients now using AI, but every one of them is using very just way. Starling is a company certified some of the folks who did the Alexa assistant at Amazon. And they're doing now a personal assistant you take home from the hospital with you after a hospital stay as a digital companion who is designed specifically to help you from being readmitted to the hospital, like home and change the behavior. Again, another transformative experience. Thrive now takes a different approach. They have coaches, digital AI coaches that are helping you with mood and emotional support. It's also one of the most interesting companies I've worked with, and that combines these AI digital coaches with core gameplay based, I shouldn't get into the details, I haven't been released in core gameplay, and also making actual cheese and fermented products and kefir. Is a French woman who started this company, and she makes really good cheese in her apartment in New York. It's quite impressive. But all of that comes into a package that somehow has to stay healthier through all these different areas. So XR, as you can see there, while I was at Google, I got to play with their glass for about a year. And despite all the many impressive companies talking, it's like having a superpower in many ways. So it's something that those of us with glass, one of the simplest things you would do is you touch the head up and you can see the time. So if I'm in a meeting and instead of being kind of read, say, I'm sorry, I'm running late. I said, I'm going to have to get going pretty soon. Another thing that it did that was very notorious, so it had the camera, and we could actually take a picture just by winking your eye. And it meant that it became a superpower. I would see something happening and I would have a picture of it. That parents, if newborn child, children, want to take a picture with smiles, you could never get your phone out in time. With class, they were getting these things. I caught a picture of a squirrel leaping for a tree in midair just because I saw it running. And I saw glass quick, and then the picture. And then people said, well, this is invasion of privacy. Well, one of the first things I learned on the people who were using the glass was somebody said, oh, by the way, if you go to a restroom, take it and like putting sunglasses on your forehead, you just tilt it up to the ceiling. And nobody cares if the camera's on if it's pointed straight up. So I'm convinced that these things will become more and more common and we will come up with social conventions, outlets for that sort of thing. So if I had glass on now, I'd know exactly how long I'm checking on speech. But for doctors, using it both to teach people, because they can now, the residents can see the exact surgeon's target view with what they're doing instead of narrating, or conversely, to see the screen of an X-ray or an MRI, simply imposed on the patient. Instead of the current state of the art, which is they're leaning over the patient and they're looking up at the rail where there's a high resolution screen and that, how much better to have the information shown to you directly when you're looking. So lots of great applications and XR. And I'm also convinced that a lot of these new AR headsets are going to do what Apple has talked about, and be able to gradually replace the phone as our key device for us. Partly because they're adding so many of these sensors to these new versions of the mounts that things like EEG and eye tracking that have been referred to, they're still not being used very much, but they have learned how to do these things very cost effectively. And we will see that more and more on head mounted displays in these types of glasses. The metal one that you see in the lower left here, I got to have a little tour of Control Labs and make the wristband that goes with that actually catches the electrical, bioelectrical signals in your arm so that you don't actually have to press a fake button. You can even just start to almost think about it and catches the data, that motion. It was very magical when I saw people would put their hands in their pockets so you couldn't tell they were touching their fingers, and control robots that go inward and want to look just like mind control. But in fact, all they were doing was taking the middleman out of having some kind of controller and having these buttons. It knew what buttons virtually they would press, and even if it has this stuff in their pockets. So lots of ways that new sensors are going to help us do these amazing things. So bringing it all together, what we're going to see in the future, I really think it's just one of many possibilities that we will have head-mounted displays that you're at a conference like we are here, and I'm notoriously bad at names and faces. Most people can do one or the other. I'm bad at both of those things. I think close to being baseline at times. I would love to have little name tags floating over people's heads. And again, for a privacy thing, it would be absolutely you sign up to and you're willing to share your name or your profession or maybe even some personal data on there so that I can find out, oh, you also have children or grandchildren. I could talk to you about how this is affecting children and their developmental needs. I'd love to be able to have that. And I used, they were wanting to mention which AI I used to generate this image because I told it to do stuff that it just didn't do. It's the duplicating extraneous information, and some of that stuff you can build English letters. And you think AI would be a little better at it'll get there. So finally, things have already been transforming healthcare for decades, and AI and XR are taking stronger and stronger roles in this. The pace of improvement, even what we saw when I was at Google of beating the American champion at Go to 6 months later beating the world champion, there was several orders of magnitude of quality between those two. And the current world champion was so confident because he knew that he was that much better that the 6-month-old version of this, how much did they change it in 6 months? Well, turned out quite a bit. And of course, that was years ago. So we're seeing rapid improvement there, which is both exciting and scary. And finally, games are transforming our lives with XR and AI. And I only see many more ways that we're going to do that. I've been trying to get a lot of my game industry cohort just to go out in a panic because the layoffs in the games industry have stock high. Well, I've never been busier as a freelancer working with this particular subset of games. And as long as you're not committed to working on the next AAA title, but have to do some silly little similar game that's just going to save people's lives, it's time to go trade. So leave it at that. I'll let you go to Slab. I'm a time for a few questions. Not to lift you.
Yeah, we have time.
But if people want to send me questions later, feel free to email me. I'll open up to questions for them.
Where's the mic? Yeah. Is there a question?
No questions.
Here. Okay.
It's not. No. If the mic.
Yeah, so the question I have is around use of AI in a clinical context with patients who are not with a clinician. How are you going?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of potential there. The main thing I'll say with the state of art of AI as a therapist and clinician and sort of thing is that under certain circumstances, for example, stroke recovery and having people do specific exercises, AI is totally up to be able to kind of show them through that, even adapt based on problems they may be having. When it gets into mental conditions, and my wife is a retired psychotherapist, and knowing what a therapist does, or if one of my current clients is doing speech therapy, I don't think AI is quite up to that level yet. But even if AI does a mediocre job with that, the fact that it can scale places like China, where they have terrible ratio of therapists to people who really need them, having a digital version that can just work on the phone, because those people, who don't have access to a human therapist almost certainly have access to a smartphone. I think we're going to see some of the first steps in those sorts of regions of the world, but also regions in healthcare where it has less potential for going wrong and more need just to have something. Another question you have? Or you see games like computer use of addiction to social media or games? Yeah, so really that's a very interesting area. I've actually been approached for people like drug addiction or they put your finger on one of the really uncomfortable areas there, the reaction of the crowd, which shows it. I think, one of the things that I've seen, this is my non-professional, non-medical opinion, is that types of addiction that are not part of our genetic heritage. In other words, people who are, as I mentioned with the nutrition gang, getting people to not eat something that they want to eat is really hard. Getting them to not drive in a dangerous way is much easier because we don't have, millions of years of evolution telling us to drive. And we do have it having to take chances at times in cars that we shouldn't, but we can actually use that. So the closer something is, I find, to a inherent problem that is medical or biological and not just a mental thing that they can kind of switch. That's the hardest kinds of changes to break. Game addiction, gambling addiction, these sort of psychological things. I have seen a lot of very promising things that can work that way, but it is a bit of a paradox in what we're doing, that the very qualities that make games useful sometimes can also make them less than useful and even harmful to people, and get some of the things they shouldn't be. But I think we're talking about ethics, saying, but
Thank you so much. Thank you. I always switch the slides and then wait for the next speakers.